Most of you have been here this whole time, but for those that haven't and those that are watching later or now on YouTube, the prior 4 weeks I spoke at length about the theology of James Luther Adams and his concept of the 5 stones. If you're hearing about this the first time, briefly, I'm going to try to catch you up in a couple of sentences. He was one of our Unitarian theologians who was physically active in trying to stave off the rise of Nazism in Germany before he moved back to the States. And his teachings from a century ago are as relevant today as they were then, unfortunately. In short, regarding the piece about the 5 stones, he was looking at the story of David and Goliath and how David, a little boy or young man, took down a giant and ended a war with 5 stones in his sling. And it would be, James Luther Adams would turn it into the modern language that is used to combat oppression. And I'm going to paraphrase one last time for the 5 stones. It'll help you memorize them. The test will be after the service for those that have been studying. What does our liberal faith say about living? I'm going to paraphrase the much longer piece, which is self as an edit of a sort by a bunch of scholars, and I'm going to use modern language that might be more familiar to us. Revelation is not sealed. In the unfolding of the human spirit, we continuously experience life in new ways, and so too does our experience of truth. 2, relationships between people ought to be free. Mutuality and consent are both ethical and theological principles. 3, we have an obligation to work toward creating a beloved community. Our faith inspires us to work the work of transformational community that is centered in justice and love. The prophethood of all believers has a corrective effect on systems of oppression. 4, each child that's born is another redeemer. We are all potential sources of good in the world, and each have a role to play. Goodness happens in relationships with one another. And 5, today's sermon, we choose hope. Our resources, both sublime and mundane, hold all the capacity we need to transform the world. We choose hope. Our resources, both sublime and mundane, hold all the capacity we need to transform the world. Each of these are interdependent with one another, and each is a way to stave off humanity's totalitarian tendencies. Revelation that is not sealed reminds us that there's no right way, no one right way to do all things. Strict adherence to creed is antithetical to the human spirit. And so is following propaganda and groupthink, other forms of creed, although less genuine or less positively intended. 2, mutuality and consent are ethical and theological principles. Fascism targets consent first. The show of power over rather than power with is the point of fascism. And you're hearing me talk about this a lot because this is what Adams was writing in relation to. These are not just intellectual deep thinking. This is what is happening on the ground today, and how can we build an ethic that informs us on how we respond. 3, building the beloved community and the prophethood of all believers. Community transcends ego, which is the classic 1920s, 30s, same time period of humanist preaching. Community transcends ego, and it transcends charlatans and narcissists. Where the Protestant Reformation made all of us priests in our own faith, Adams is anointing us all prophets to speak truth to power for the wholeness of the community, centered in justice and centered in love. And 4, each child that's born is another redeemer. Fascism wants to segregate, separate, and scapegoat whatever other they can come up with. If love is truly at our center and every child is another redeemer, we remember that we need all of us. We need for all of us to survive. And this 5th stone today, we choose hope. We'll be talking about a community vision today and our individual choices to choose hope. Fascism wants us to feel demoralized, to wonder what the point is, or to forget our own power, to forget our own agency. We began this series talking a little bit about science and perception, and our faith teaches about the evolution of our ethics and our expressed religious practice. And I say evolution in the scientific sense of adapting to the current reality rather than the sense of better and better forever and ever. Perpetual growth for the sake of growth is a quirk of a bad take on a bad read of textbook economics. And Adams is teaching us about depth, not expansion. And so we'll end with this sermon, this in the series, not the sermon ending, with another discussion about science and ethics. There's a notion, and I'm not sure where I first encountered it, that makes a distinction about the evolution of science and the evolution of ethics. It suggests that they differ in one notable way. As science unfolds, it progresses on what came before. Each generation is faced with new learnings that are rooted in old learnings, and the body of scientific knowledge, scientific knowing, gets passed on to the next generation to pick it up from where scientists left off. Barring catastrophes like the Dark Ages or scientists not following peer review properly, which then is not the process, science isn't lost, it perennially moves forward. It will likely unfold with experts developing into further and further specializations so that each area of subspecialty gets more and more nuanced and hopefully advanced. Ethics is a different creature. Although our scholars in the field may function the same way, building off what came before, like theology does and ethics does, right? As a people, each generation as a people need to learn and relearn the same lessons. Why is war the worst solution? Why are basic civil rights a thing each generation needs to fight for over and over? Why do we enter and recreate financial crises that we knew would occur, the proverbial market bubbles that we force upon ourselves again and again in the name of perpetual growth and ever and always more and more? It's because as human creatures, our communal intellect may be willing to build off the Lego blocks of past advancements in science, but our hearts have to start from the beginning with each new generation. What is our take on this thing that happened before? What does it mean to us? How do I internalize it? How do I respond to it? And ethics has the additional challenge that there are bad actors in the world who will lie to us, or to themselves, or to both themselves and us. And they are the good and to themselves that they're actually the good actors and not the bad ones. We see a lot of them in the world. For communities, ethics is learned from the ground up, with an ever-challenging cultural peer review panel, so to speak, whose rules are written and rewritten for every generation. Like I was talking as a quip about Vanessa Southern, Reverend, who was the chair of my RSCC regional subcommittee. That was another instance of the community creating cultural peer review panels, a way in which we say as a community, these are our values. Come on back in. Let's make sure we're holding to them. And science starts from the shoulders of past giants, theoretically, in theory, with a consensus. Now, that statement has a way about it that's painted in broad strokes. Even if science can give a clear answer, like on the question or non-question of climate change, ethics deeply influences our ability to accept it as an answer. We're watching, as time goes on, that people that used to deny it are now denying that it's happening, but it's not man-made. And there's a constant kind of shift that indicates someone's just not willing to internalize or accept science answer on something that we don't want to face. Likewise, we seem to be able to make the processing power of computers multiply by 1.5 times annually, and that has been true for as long as I've been alive. I almost said how long. But ethics seems to stall our improvement of fuel efficiency and our choices to even research renewable resources. But the basic notion is still accurate. We have all the resources to transform the world, but we don't always choose to do so. Spiritually, there's a way in which that feels exhausting. September 17th, we're joining the Global Climate March again. In lieu of the worship here, it'll be over on the west side in Central Park. Information's in the website and in the e-blast. And I mention that because, again, we're going to be marching again. But we still haven't learned anything from the last time we marched. There is that kind of, that pressure feels exhausting to do it over and over again. And I'm talking about climate, it could be talking about women's agency, a whole range of things. We all have the capacity to effect the changes we need, but we often don't have the moral courage, or maybe the moral willpower, to pass on the lessons in ways that seem to match. But we can choose to flip that script. Despair sets in when we think we can't affect change. And the rise of totalitarianism in all of its guises, that's its first goal. To set despair in, to make us think that we can't change anything. That's either rooted in cynicism, or that's rooted in facts that paint a big bleak picture, because we have a pretty bleak picture right now, a bunch of them. Let's look at both. Staying with the science road, history tells us that the facts of science seem to indicate we have all the capacity we need to affect the change in the world. It does. From polio, we saw that, to penicillin, to the moon landing, to the ozone layer. When I was a kid, it was imminent in the 80s. That ozone layer is going, and it's going to impact us. And a conservative president somehow managed to just change the narrative, and we made the changes we needed to, and the ozone layer is healed in my lifetime, in our lifetime. They can give us challenges that we can unite behind, and they can give us generations to accomplish it, and we can do it. That's the fact. We have all the capacity we need. Cynicism looks at perfect outcomes and pretends that those perfect outcomes are the new benchmark to follow. Who has ever had a perfect outcome in your life? Are your hands working, arms working, or no one has had a perfect outcome? Good, because that would be scary, and you probably should buy the lottery ticket or something. But when we in our own lives realize nothing is ever going to be a perfect outcome, when we go into the bigger picture where there's 8 billion people, however many there are now, that are not going to agree with you in all the same ways. So it's not going to be perfect. If we don't reach the benchmark of perfect, then the solution is flawed, and so what's the point? And that's what cynicism does. Lesser two evils, or if this is not exactly the way I want it, or, well, we can do that, but these other 6 things aren't fixed, even though we're fixing 7 of them. All of that leads to inertia. There's some interesting blogs out there wrestling with our political situations and the impacts of cynicisms that I'm not going to go into here. We're going to get nauseated in a few months with all the election cycle. But there's a lot of thought out there on this topic of cynicism that you might want to look into on your own. Google search it. And remember, Adams is telling us, reminding us, as an ethical truth, our resources, both sublime and mundane, hold all the capacity we need to transform the world. And science has shown us that over and over again. History presents both an onerous and a hopeful record. Each generation must imprint humanity's moral progress upon the tablets of our hearts anew. And for those that have not heard that phrase, it's a traditional line in Hebrew scripture. And it goes back to a time where the idea was you write something on the tablet of your heart, on a tablet, so that when the tablet breaks, when your heart breaks, all that positivity, all those intentions, all those people you remember fall into your heart when the tablet breaks. Each generation must imprint humanity's moral progress upon the tablets of our hearts anew, because they're going to break. We can choose to look at that with despair for the effort, or we can choose to look upon that with awe. We have the capacity to impress humanity's moral progress anew. It's a matter of will, it's a matter of personal and communal choices. That's our spiritual charge as a religious community. In a few short weeks, we'll be entering the High Holy Days in the Jewish liturgical calendar. And I ask this now because I won't have a chance to preach again until later in the fall after doing 6 this summer. How do we begin again in hope after seasons of hardship? As we are come upon these days of awe, can we bear witness to their lessons and apply them to the choice for hope? Do we look upon past choices with despair, or do we choose to look upon them with awe? And it's a flip side, despair and awe. For the month of September, following Reverend Peggy's liturgical calendar, our sermons and services will be imagining what it would mean to be a people of renewal. How do our choices impact that imagination? I once heard our regional lead from the Central East region of the UUA, the Reverend Megan Foley. She was leading worship for 40-plus clergy, and she had a really silly metaphor that's really helpful here. She spoke of earlobes and nostrils. Earlobes, nostrils, in case we get lost in the map. I'm going from memory, so I'll get to the gist rather than the quote. But I thank you for getting me to think in this direction. In the body of life, we all have a role. If you're an earlobe, your role is to be the best earlobe you can be. It's not to create more earlobes. It's not to make the nostril over there act more like an earlobe. That'd be a problem for a lot of us, right? You may want to put off some effort. You might want to put in some effort to help the nostril be the best nostril it can be if you're an earlobe. But that's as far as you should go from your role as earlobe, because the world still needs someone to be an earlobe. That metaphor got me thinking a lot about our mission as a religious community in the face of hardship and hope. We function as a group of individuals, but we also function as a group of groups. There are bodies, committees, teams, task forces that help move forward our social justice work and our anti-racism work, who help to maintain our men's refugee shelter, who create and curate art, who offer communal pastoral care, and on and on. We don't need our membership team, for example, to take over our shelter team, or maybe our membership team could maybe help identify folks in the congregation who might be a good fit to help out in our shelter, for example. Or our church council doesn't need to figure out the solutions to a better office system, but it can help us to identify when something isn't working or something is working fabulously. In a community as large as ours, the minutiae matters if we want to achieve our common purpose. The earlobes and nostrils of fellowship work, of congregational work, lead to a common purpose. In religious community, we nurture our individual spirits through caring for one another and helping to heal the world. Those are words, but the impact can be larger. We care for our members in times of crisis as best we can. We all do that. When we know of the challenge, of course, we have to know it. We offer shelter throughout the year and collect and distribute food to those in need. We partner with nonprofits the world over, our denomination as well as local groups and intake shelters, offering funds or organizing or marching, like September 17th, or simply following their lead, and on and on. And that list takes a ton of minutia to happen. We need earlobes and nostrils, as unexciting as that work sometimes sounds. Although maybe being a nostril is the most wonderful thing you could ever imagine. And then that's wonderful for you and great. Thank you for laughing at that. And that work can become life-saving and life-affirming. Jill, our DRE, and I were going through New York Cares to figure out projects we could have multi-ages get together and help volunteer. And so many of them were just innocuous, otherwise unheroic, boring things like packing groceries or unpacking groceries. And that is literally life-saving for someone. It's just a matter of things have to get done sometimes. In these days of renewal and the coming days of awe in the Jewish calendar, it's not just the sublime sunset or the quiet of the garden that affirms our spirits. It can be the mundane, everyday task that takes 30 years to build or rebuild, that also affirms our spirits and blesses our hands to do the work ahead. In religious community, we nurture our individual spirits through caring for one another and helping to heal the world. If I were to whittle that down to 3 words, what would they be? Community, individual, world. If that were it, it would mean community draws the individual into the world. And that's a necessity we have these days as we're relearning to reintegrate in the midst of an oscillating pandemic. Maybe we could say nurture, caring, and healing. In a too often broken feeling world, healing can only come when the people choose the path of compassion and support. That's true too. What I see as central to our religious purpose is the reality that we need to be drawn out of our individual concerns into an accountable community that chooses to heal these corners of the world through care and justice. And that long sentence is what James Luther Adams is talking about by being committed to voluntary associations. And that's the point of them, to keep the community knit together in all these different ways. Sometimes that will be hard, sometimes that will be uncomfortable, sometimes that means that our individual opinions will be in conflict with another's views, and we do so together. I'll close with a matched theological demand to James Luther Adams' fifth stone. I see the matching demand of progressive faith to be this question, these questions. Does this thing remind me to live with hope? When we are faced with a belief that challenges us or leads us to despair, our faith tells us that it's misleading, it's a lie. If our faith truly teaches that of us, our resources, both sublime and mundane, hold all the capacity we need to transform the world, and it does. Then any theology that seeks to cause us to forget hope is a theology that is misleading. It's a lie. Hope doesn't mean easy. It doesn't mean perfect. It does protect us from having to endure through periods of exhaustion or boredom or minutia. But it does make sure we face the world with a healthy sense of awe and possibility. Awe and possibility. Amen and blessed be.